Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. And alhamdulillah, bihi nasta'een, wa salatu wa salam ala sayyid al-mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. I think I recognize some of you. You were in my classes, maybe, and I taught many times in this room. So I'm happy to be back at a different season. I've never felt the feeling of being cold before in Sarajevo. Although it's actually not that bad, so I haven't really been cold even here. Especially since I ran over here from Hojic, Javapi, what is that called? Yeah, I was, my family is still eating their food, but I left early to come over here. Okay, so thanks for inviting me. It really makes me happy to come here, and I'm happy to see my old friends and be with the Muslim community here. So the specific topic I'm going to discuss might be a little bit, I can't tell, maybe it's usual or unusual for a Balkan, South Slavic speaking audience, but it's kind of globally in the news, so probably you've come across it, which is the idea of like anti-Blackness, kind of racism against Black people or against Africans, people of African descent. And specifically, this is actually kind of a big deal in the United States and other places, but certainly in like kind of Western Muslim context, which is the accusation that Islam as a religion is like racist against Black people, that Islam is like anti-Black religion. This is actually unusually common accusation that's made. It's made by a variety of different parties, kind of conservatives in the United States. It's used by, let's say, like Israeli or pro-Israeli media to try and break, let's say, like kind of third world solidarity. Actually, since I'm in former Yugoslavia, kind of non-aligned, anti-first world solidarity, right? To show, you know, hey, Black Muslims, African Muslims, Africans in general, why do you care about Palestine? Why do you care about the Palestinians? Because they're Arabs and Muslims and Arabs are racist against Black people. Look at this hadith, look at the Quran, right? So, and then it's an argument that's used in the United States specifically because it's obviously a very sensitive topic in the United States as a way to kind of undermine Muslims, to make it so Muslims can't stand up for social justice issues, issues of rights and things, because people just say, oh, you're Muslims and Muslims are anti-Black, so you have no leg to stand on if you want to make arguments about civil rights or fair treatment, right? And I think, so I'm going to talk about some of the specifics of this discussion, which are actually very interesting, not just from a, topical interest, but I think if you're interested in Islamic history, if you're interested in understanding scripture in Islam and globally, it's a fascinating topic. You end up kind of getting taken down a lot of different paths that are all very interesting as scholars. So, the first thing to just acknowledge, I think it's very important, is that kind of, if we think about Islamic civilization, not in its entirety, because Islamic civilization includes a massive number of people who would be considered, they would consider themselves Black, they would be considered by Western people to be Black, right? People who live in Africa, in the Sahel, and south of Sahara. There's literally millions and millions and millions and millions and millions, dozens and dozens of millions of Muslims who live their entire lives around only Black Muslims, right? So, that was true in the 1500s, it's true in the 1800s, it's true today. So this notion that we're going to talk about Islamic civilization as being anti-Black is kind of silly, because a giant component of that civilization is actually Black and African, which is very different than if we were talking about, let's say, anti-Blackness in Yugoslavia. I don't know, former Yugoslavia, right? I mean, I don't. Is there an issue in Bosnia and Herzegovina? I don't know, but it's not something that you can't say we have a massive African population here, or maybe you do. I have not seen this. Okay, so
we have Roma, for instance. We have Roma.
Yeah, Roma, which is actually, this is very interesting, because guess what? When you look at, let's say, medieval or even modern depictions of Roma, what are they depicted? What are they called? They're called black. This is interesting because the concept of blackness actually has no necessary relationship to the color of your skin. We'll talk about that in a second. Blackness is about lower, bad, and it doesn't matter if you're Norwegian, as we'll see, you can actually be called black in the right situation. Okay, but if we talk about, let's say, we want to call, some people call it the Islamic Heartland. I don't like that, but Marshall Hodgson would call it the Nile to Oxus region, between the Nile and Oxus River. Maybe you could think actually about, let's say, North Africa, Morocco, across the Mediterranean Muslim world, into the Persianate Muslim world, of which the Bosnians are a wonderful part of, although they bring a Slavic element into that Persianate Muslim world, into Central Asia, into India, right? So if we think about the Muslim world, excluding Sub-Saharan Africa and excluding Southeast Asia, because as far as I know, and I've tried to look into this, I haven't found any examples. There's not a lot of examples of kind of anti-blackness in Southeast Asia historically, which is interesting on its own. But if you want to talk about kind of, let's say, the Arab and Persianate and Turkic worlds of Islamic civilization, there is a lot of anti-blackness. There's a lot of anti-black sentiment. And that doesn't, by the way, this isn't, I'm not engaging in some, I'm not here to slap you on the hand or anything like that. This isn't, I'm not moralizing. This is just statements of fact, right? You can go, if you go back and you look at Arabic or Turkic or Persian literature in the year 1500 or 1200 or 1000, you're going to see lots of, making fun of people for being black, associating, blackness with being stupid, with being very appetitive, like constantly wanting to eat, very, excuse me, my French, sexually kind of voracious. You're going to find lots of these ideas. Now, I bring this up first and foremost just to say this becomes a reality of Islamic civilization in those central Islamic lands, roughly from, let's say, the 800s onward. Okay, and that this is very different kind of phenomenon of anti-blackness than what you have in the United States. It's very different than what you have in Western Europe. It's very different from anti-blackness in general in the world, the anti-blackness that starts with the transatlantic slave trade in essentially the 1500s and 1600s, right? That creates a totally different issue. Another, I'm forgetting the word in English, bag of worms, bucket of worms. Another issue, okay? It's another issue which we're not even gonna get into because it's not a Muslim problem per se, right? So and it's not the topic. But kettle of fish. Can of worms and a kettle of fish. So I apparently can't speak my own language anymore, let alone Bosnian. Okay, so, but where does this come from? That's first and foremost, I think it's an important thing to talk about. If you go back and you look at Greco-Roman notions of geography and ethnology, like where do peoples come from, different peoples come from, you'll find a very common idea, which is that not only how you look, but your temperament, your character is tied to the environment. It's actually shaped by the environment, which actually is not, at least physically, not that different. As I always tell my kids, they're like, why aren't we black? And they'll say, why are we white? And they'll say, why? They say, why are other people not white? I said, well, that's not the question. The question is, why aren't we black? Because our ancestors, way back when, I don't know, well, there's different arguments. One argument you could say is that God created Adam from a handful of dirt, and there's different colors in the dirt, and that people have different colors. And you could also reconcile that, I'm sure, with the idea that some human beings wandered north, and they're like, there's no sun here. I'm running out of vitamin D. And so some of them were, over centuries, their skin turned white colored, right? All right, so the idea in this Greco-Roman notion of race and geography is that the middle latitudes is like the moderates. It's the mu'tadil. It's everything is, you have the just right amount of bravery, of smartness, of strength. Your physically and character, your moral, your culture is the best, right? And is everything okay? What's happening? Okay. So both to the north and the south, you go to the atraf. You're going away from al-i'tidal and toward at-tatarruf. So, and this is very interesting, and I'm sorry to tell you this, Ahmed. I don't think Slavs did very well in these descriptions, okay? So a lot of the descriptions, going back to Greco-Roman times, Africans get, you know, they're hasty, they're kind of, they don't really reason very well. Same thing with the northern people, because they're also away from the extreme. But whereas the Africans are like, they have a hot temperament, because the weather's hot. The northern people have a cold temperament. And they have short, stubby, yeah, they have short, stubby noses, and they like to drink alcohol a lot. That's very brave, but always drunk, and also incapable of reasoning. I'm not endorsing these ideas, I'm just reporting them, okay? So this is exactly the scientific and cultural heritage that Muslims inherit when they enter the Near Eastern world, when they kind of leave Arabia, enter into the Near Eastern world. And so they start having the same ideas. So that's the stereotypes we see in medieval Islamic civilization about Africans are exactly the same stereotypes that you'd see 1,000 years earlier, 500 years earlier in Greco-Roman times. Except, by the way, that a lot of Muslim scholars rejected this for precisely the reason I just alluded to, which is they said, you know, okay, Ibn Khaldun, you have your theory about this, which is what Ibn Khaldun's ideas, but we know from hadith that Adam was created, I think it's in Sunan al-Tirmidhi, or Jami' al-Tirmidhi, God was created, human being, Adam's from this fistful of dirt, and that there's different colors in that. So a lot of Muslim scholars, kind of hadith or scripturally oriented scholars, didn't accept these ideas because they thought they were based in kind of weird Greco-Roman science, which they didn't find convincing. All right. Now, we covered kind of the background of how this anti-black sentiment comes into Islamic civilization. So let's talk about blackness in the time of the Prophet. It's an interesting question. How many of you have heard stories about Bilal, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and Bilal trying to get married? Bilal, when he wanted to get married, people wouldn't accept him. Right? And then the Prophet ﷺ had to basically say to one family, you're going to let this guy marry your sister. Okay? Question, there's another companion, there are twice as many stories about him having a hard time getting married, twice the number of Bilal's stories. Does anyone know who that companion is? Huh? There's another companion who had double the amount of trouble that Bilal had getting married. Not? No? I'm curious. Nobody has a guess? Come on, give me a guess. Somebody. You with the glasses. Glasses means you're intelligent. Let's hear it. That's my physio. You have a guess? Salman al-Farisi. Because guess why? Guess why these people? Do you know who else had black skin? Safwan bin Umayyah, the master of Bilal. The son of his owner, right? Safwan bin Umayyah. Amr ibn al-As. According to some reports, Umar ibn al-Khattab, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, two of his grandparents one of them was Ethiopian, and one of them, we don't know what they were, but they were called black. We don't know if that means Ethiopian or just had very dark skin. Have you ever heard of Amr ibn al-As having trouble getting married, or Safwan bin Umayyah having trouble getting married? No. Guess, because in the time of the Prophet, in Arabia of the Prophet's time, only one thing matters, being in a tribal system. If you're in an elite member of a tribe, it doesn't matter what you look like. And remember, because a lot of their mothers, it doesn't matter who your mother is, right? It matters who your father is, who your father's father's father is. If your father's father was a noble Arab, and every single one of the mothers is a captive from this place, a slave from that place, doesn't matter. You are who your asaba, your patrilineal ancestor is. Okay, so it's not the color of your skin. Why did Bilal have trouble getting married? What is common between Bilal and Salman al-Farisi? They're both foreigners. They're foreigners from outside the tribal system. Okay, so and by the way, you'll see people say, like about the Quraysh insulting Bilal, this ghurab, this crow, you know, because what do they say to Salman? They said, tell us your ancestors. Give us your nasab. He doesn't know who his ancestors are. He says, Ana Salman ibn al-Islam. That's his response. My point is, they go after whatever it is that's a sign of you being a foreigner. In the case of Bilal, it's the fact that he looks Ethiopian. Okay. So this is very important, because what you see is in the time of the Prophet, the people who get attacked for their blackness, this is just a proxy for their being an outsider in the tribal system. And there's people like Salman who get attacked for the same thing, but obviously they're attacked for different reasons, right? It's like when I don't know, when you're back in the playground, maybe people don't do this in Bosnia, but I have a feeling they do. When your kid's on the playground and you get in a fight with someone, you go, if this guy is short, you call him shorty. If this guy's fat, you call him fatty. If this guy's, has big ears, you call him big earsy, or whatever you call the person, right? So you just go after whatever you have to work with. Same thing with, by the way, hijab poetry, Arabic poetry, insult poetry. They go with whatever they can find about this guy. I know what I'm going to go with on this guy, You crack their knuckles and get ready. Okay. So let's talk about specific examples. People will say, and I'm not going to get into who says this, but I'm just going to trust me that people level these attacks on Islam, and I'm going to address them. They say the Quran is anti-black. Why is the Quran anti-black? Yamun tabyadul wujuh wa taswadul wujuh. Wujuhum muswadda, right? The day of judgment, there'll be faces that are whitened and faces that are blackened. They say, look, this is anti-black. Okay. In order to understand this, you have to understand the notion of blackness as metaphor and whiteness as metaphor, which is, by the way, totally obvious. It's not in every language that I know of, but it's almost universal in languages. Almost. Light/white is good. Black/dark is bad. Why is it? By the way, this is true even in languages spoken in Africa south of Sahara. Zulu, Shona, Wolof, Fulbe, Jarma, lots of other examples. You can see people whose languages, if you ask them in their language, what color are you? They say black. Then they say, okay, what if you say someone's like black-hearted or they have a black stomach? That language might have a phrase that uses black in a negative way, even though when they talk about their skin, it doesn't mean anything bad. So even people, not every language, but many languages in Africa south of Sahara, you have a language where they will refer to their own skin color as black and also use black in a negative metaphor. Why is this? Okay, there's a couple basic reasons. One is, last time I checked, my son asked me this question today. Can humans live in the water? No, I said, humans can't live in the water. We can go in the water we were at the Thermal Hills Hotel thermal swimming pool. So humans, we live on land. Another thing about humans, do we do stuff during the day or night? Nahar ma'asha wa layla subata, right? We go outside in the daytime, and what are we scared of? Does that kid ever say, I'm scared of the light? I'm scared of daytime. You're scared of the dark. Why are you scared of the dark? Because you don't know what's there. You don't know what's out there. So darkness, black, bad. Lightness, white, good. This is nothing to do with favoring one look over the other look. Okay. Another reason, and this is not true for all of humans, but this is certainly true in human populations where people's skin tone tends to register sun exposure. So some humans, they can stay in the sun all day and they don't look different than if they weren't in the sun. Other humans, Ahmed, me, definitely you, okay? Here we go in the sun and you're gonna get sunburned. Now I have a question. How do I know if Professor Kenan is rich? Well, nowadays, actually, has anyone ever seen like?
Not anymore.
Yeah, but so if you want to know, if you ever see like a politician, like American politician or something, or really rich guy, they always have a nice tan. Donald Trump, they always have a nice tan, right? If you see someone with a nice tan, it means I have enough time and money to go and artificially expose myself to the sun. Like, by the way, I have enough time to go to the gym and be really thin. Even though maybe 100, 200 years ago, being as thin as some model is like this, they think this person's gonna die. No one would ever wanna marry them because they think they're gonna die 2 days from now. Now it's a sign of wealth because you have the luxury of going to the gym. So, but let's pretend that not everyone's stuck inside working in office jobs. People are out on the field working in the farms. How do I tell a rich person from a farmer? Rich person is going to be light skinned. They don't go in the sun. Same thing with women, right? So the beautiful woman is the white skinned woman, the light colored, because she's from a wealthy family. She doesn't have to go outside and do anything. So there's a kind of socioeconomic element as well. Okay. Now, very interesting. When you look at these verses in the Quran, how did Muslim scholars understand them? Did they understand them as you become looking like African person? Or you look, Ahmed, we're going to go on the Day of Judgment, and everyone's going to look like Ahmed if they're good, and going to look like, a black guy if they're bad? No. This is not, as Fakhr al-Razi says, this is sawad yukhalif sa'ir anwa' as-sawad, right? This is a type of blackness that's not earthly blackness. This is not like white and black in our language. This is otherworldly. Similarly, you'll see other reports that are like tafsir reports, not from the Quran, but the people in Jannah, their faces are white like ice. So they don't say white like, a really white Syrian guy or something like that. They say white like ice. And they also specify, it doesn't say, wujuhum yawma'idhin sawda. It says muswadda, because this is a process they went through on the Day of Judgment. This is not they're black people and then they come into heaven and they have black faces. This is a process you go through. It's not an earthly process. There's no link to what people look like in this world. And of course, they interpret it as what? As whiteness is sharaf, sa'ada, right? And blackness is like sadness, huzn, right? Shaqi, shaqawa, right? Okay, so this is a very clear understanding. Which, by the way, I'm not going to talk about any other religion. So I'm just going to only talk about Islam. So now this is, what else is really interesting? There's a famous Nordic poem. It's called the Rigstula. It's written between 900 and about maybe 1200 AD. It's Old Norse poetry, right? So it's in Old Norse language. One of the things it talks about is the origins of the different social classes. Nobles, jarls, farmers, and then slaves. The story is this god, I think it's Odin or someone like that, or Thor. Maybe it's Thor. I can't remember who. Thor comes down to Earth, and Thor has relationships with 3 different relationships, producing 3 different children. The child that's born as a slave, the noble is described as blonde hair, light-colored skin. The farmer is red hair, light-colored skin. The slave is, guess what? Black. Do you know where slaves in Norse society were taken from?
Sorry, which society?
Norse society, like Scandinavian, medieval Scandinavian. Sometimes, a little bit. But Irish, so Celtic, Irish, other Slavic, Scandinavian people, and Slavs. Do any of these people qualify as black? Do any of these people actually qualify as any darker than the average Scandinavian person? No. And it's interesting when you see the further descriptions of the thrall, the slave. He's black, black hair, black skin, sunburned, dirty hands. So here you have the notion, the overlap of like blackness with this dirtiness, the sunburnedness, the low socioeconomic status. So, in fact, and by the way, same thing with Anglo-Saxons when they're talking about Welsh in like the 900s, 1000s, 1100s, 1200s. They're black, the black Welsh, the dark-skinned Welsh. The black is whoever you've decided is the person who's so low that you can go grab them and make them a slave, even if they don't look different from you. It's very interesting. because the metaphor here, the metaphor of blackness, is actually creeping into the way we talk about people's physicality, even if their physical description is no different from our own. Okay. So that's an important point when you think about the Quran is, and by the way, something I forgot to mention. When the Prophet ﷺ, during his final sermon and at other points in the Hadith corpus, he talks about, for example, I was sent to two groups, the red and the black. Who's the red and the black? These are two different types of humans. These are black people and red people. Red people are like, people in the kind of Syria, northern Mediterranean, and black people are black Africans and Arabs. The general idea, if you look at scholars, is that the Arabs are amongst the blacks in this group. It's interesting. Arabs don't really talk, in the time of the Prophet, in early Islamic history, you don't really see them talk about black and white as physical characteristics. You see black and white as like honored, dishonored. Wajh muswadda, wajh or miswad, and wajh mubiyad, right? Wajh is mudhakkar muannath. Is it? Wajh muswadda, wajh.
No, mudhakkar.
Yeah. So I was correct the first time, right? Yes. Okay, good. That's excellent. Okay, so when I have a question, when the Hadith corpus, when it talks about human appearances, it either talks about red and black, or it talks about red, white, and black. Red being like kind of, like for example, Suhaib al-Rumi. Bosnians are all red, basically, right? And then there's white is like a kind of lighter skinned Arab, and then black is darker skinned Arab, and then Africans and Indians. This is how they would divide, like how, so it's very interesting. When, in early Islamic literature, when they talk about someone as aswad, a man is aswad, a woman is sauda, it could mean they're African, it could mean they're Indian, it could mean that they're just really dark skinned and for any number of reasons. So it doesn't actually overlap totally with, there's not like it's not concentric, is that concentric? It's not coterminous with African. All right. So then let's talk about hadiths. Now, there's a lot of forged hadiths that insult black people. There are forgeries. And if you look at Ibn al-Jawzi in his works, died 597, 1200 of the Common Era. Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah died 1351 in his Manar al-Munif, al-Manar al-Munif. If you look at basically but almost all the books of like Mustalahat al-Hadith or books on Hadith criticism from the 1300s onwards, they'll almost always say a rule, which is that if there's a Hadith, a report that insults like a certain people or demeans them, it can't be from the Prophet. It's just not possible that the Prophet said this as a matter of principle. A lot of the hadiths that are reported to be from the Prophet, like for example, Al-Abd al-Aswad, إذا جاء سرق وإذا شبع zana, right? So the black slave or the zenji, different versions of the hadith, if they get hungry, they steal. If they get full, they fornicate. Right? You have lots of taqwa zenj, لأنهم what is it? Like qawmun mushawwaha, I think is a verse that they're like a disfigured, right? Void the zenj because they're disfigured. These hadiths are all forgeries. They're forgeries by principle, according to hadith scholars, and they're also forgeries just empirically when you look at the isnads. Either they don't have isnads or their isnads are unreliable. Right? And you can find this, by the way, much earlier than Ibn al-Jawzi in the 1200s. You can find it Abu Dawood, Sijistani. Someone comes and says this hadith about blacks being disfigured. He says if you hear someone say this, then they're not reliable. You just dismiss them as a narrator if they report this. And you find also similar statements expressed by other Muslim scholars from the early period and up until the modern period. So there's a lot of hadiths that are just flat out forgeries. Why were they why did they appear anywhere? Why did any Muslim scholars allow this in their books? We talked about the way that anti-black sentiments seeps into Islamic culture, and those people, a lot of scholars were affected by this. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes you find them in books like, let's say, the Mu'jam of Tabarani or Hilyat al-Awliya of Abu Nu'aym al-Isbahani. These hadiths, these books, the authors themselves have no. They would not tell you that everything in this book is sahih. They say, no, there's all sorts of stuff in these books. Their book is in no way concerned with authenticating material. You could still ask them, and by the way, they were criticized by scholars like Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi, like by Ibn al-Jawzi, by people like al-Albani in the modern period, who said, this is irresponsible what you did. People don't know this. They come and read your book and they don't know, they're not hadith specialists. They can't go and look at the isnad. So you should warn people. This is like, you're running the risk of fooling people, of deluding them, of misguiding them. But this is another issue, which is a whole different topic. Then finally, there was a very interesting hadith. You see it in Sahih Bukhari. It's, and there's several versions of this hadith through different companions. Well, they all, in effect, go back to the context is Abu Dhar being spoken to by the Prophet ﷺ. One version says, "Isma'u wa ati'u," so listen and obey. "Wala ustumil alaykum abdun mujadda'un," right? So listen and obey your commander, even if the person who's put in charge over you is a slave who's got their ears cut off or their nose cut off. So you see this even in medieval Byzantine times. If you wanted to make someone so someone was even like an emperor who got cast off the throne or usurped, or they would cut his nose off or to disfigure the person. They wouldn't be able to be a leader. So even if the person is a slave who's got their ears cut off or something, you have to listen and obey. What is the Prophet's intention in this hadith? You see it in Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari. Listen, the person who's put in charge of you, obey them, even if they're the lowest person. Their rank in your social standing doesn't matter. By the way, we know from other hadiths that إنما أطاع في المعروف, right? You only obey people. You can't obey somebody. لا طاعة في المخلوق في معصية الخالق, right? You can't. If a created being, a human being, tells you to do something haram, you don't obey them. You have to obey God. So this is of course not some kind of license that you have to do whatever your commander says or your governor says, no matter what. But if they say, okay, our unit is going to go over here, you listen and you obey. Or if the governor says, okay, the speed limit is now 35 kilometers per hour, you have to listen and obey. That's one version. This actually goes back from Shu'bah, I think, then Abu Tayyah, and then Abu Dhar, I think, is that isnad. The other version is from Anas bin Malik, and that version I just said is the most common version. The most common version. There's one version, which is in Sahih Bukhari, where it goes back to Anas from Shu'bah through one link to Anas bin Malik, who says, I heard the Prophet say to Abu Dhar, Isma'u wa ati'u, wala ustumil alaykum abdun habashiyun ka'anna ra'suhu zabiba. Right? So even if the person who's put in charge of you is an Ethiopian slave whose head looks like or is like a raisin. You know what a raisin is, right? Okay. So this, people say, this is also anti-black, sort of its insulting image. Well, there's an interesting question. I'm not going to contest the reliability of a hadith in Sahih Bukhari. I'm not going to get in that debate. But it's interesting that the vast majority of the versions of this hadith don't have the raisin simile. They just mention Abdun Habashiyan or Mujadda al-Atraf, or Mujadda, right? Just with like a mutilated face. But the one version that goes back not to Abu Dhar, the person who heard it himself, but to Anas bin Malik, who's recalling what he heard said, has this simile of his head looking like a raisin. So, is this in fact anti-black? This is an interesting question. and I think this is a situation in which we have to look at like our current sensibilities are not the sensibilities of human beings throughout history. Right? So there is a British author, I think a few years ago or 2 years ago, actually just I think this last year, she wrote a book, and she's a teacher, and she's talking about her history of teaching and her experience with all these students, and her book won a bunch of awards, and she talks about one student who had chocolate-colored skin. And she got in a lot of trouble for this. And somebody said, you know, nobody likes to have their body compared to food. You know, no one likes to. This is just insulting. This may or may not be true. I'm not going to adjudicate this topic, but I'm simply going to say that in certainly medieval Islamic civilization and medieval Christian civilization, this was not considered offensive to say somebody looked like a certain thing, right? It's not. It was maybe a little bit less sensitive time, right? And you can see this, by the way, in the Quran when it talks about la yastawi al-a'ma wal-basir. The Quran many times uses blindness and being able to see as a metaphor or a comparison for people who are guided, people who are astray, people who've heeded revelation, people who deny revelation. In fact, we have enormous amount of evidence that blind companion, Ibn Maktoum, right? This is a person who the Quran refers to twice indirectly, right? Is blind. A number of the prominent companions are blind. And we don't have any evidence, at least I have not come across anything, and if anyone's found anything, I would love to hear it. I would really like to hear it. I'm not just saying that. Please tell me. We don't have any evidence of these people saying, hey, I'm offended by this, this comparison. Because this was just their body. God gave them this test. God gives some people blessings in some ways and tests in other ways. God gives some people tests in other ways and blessings in other ways, right? So this was their test, and they didn't seem to have any kind of crisis-level resentment about it, or they weren't offended by this. At least I've found no evidence of this. I have not found any evidence. So this notion that using like physical disability or physical description as a tool for metaphor is not just common not just found in the Quran. This is found kind of globally, right, in human heritage. So here's a question. One possibility with this hadith is that, I'm not saying this is the case, I'm just saying one possibility is this narration that talks about the raisin is a minority narration and it shouldn't be considered the authoritative version of the hadith. That's one possibility. The other possibility is, let's look at how Muslim scholars understood this hadith. It's interesting, until around the 1200s of the Common Era, Muslim scholars, when they talk about it, either they don't discuss it, it's obvious to them, they don't even get into what it means, or they say raisin is because it's dark colored, and because the texture of the raisin is like, they say it's like the texture of Ethiopian person's hair. They say tefalful, like peppercorns. It's an interesting description. Peppercorny. You know what peppercorns are? You know what these are? Like the pepper, you grind, it's a little thing and you grind it and it makes pepper, right? It's like a little ball that's wrinkly. Yeah, so if you take that and if you put like a bunch of them, imagine like a bunch of them on a table together, just like in a group, that this looks like an Ethiopian person's hair. This is what the Muslim scholars said. Then, so they said it's just color and like texture of hair. In the 1200s and afterwards, you start seeing it gets a little bit nastier. Like they start saying this is talking about haqara, like the haqara of the slave, the kind of low status, the debased status, his kind of, and the imagery is the same, right? We know from this hadith in the beginning, what is the Prophet, what is he trying to say? He's saying, you people have all your notions of who's in charge and who's better and who's worse. And none of that means anything. The person who's the lowest person in your society, if they're made the authority over you, you obey them, right? So the message of the hadith is clear, and it's also not controversial. The only controversy would be if we didn't have these other reports that told us about how you can't be told to do something haram, how you don't obey somebody if they're telling you to do injustice, etc. After the 1200s, you start to see, the same message in the hadith, but they start to talk about like, yeah, the kind of low status of the black African, the low status of the slave. Now, this is all interesting, except here's the thing. Those commentators that we're talking about, Al-Khattabi, Qadi Iyad, Al-Kirmani, Ibn Hubayra, Al-Saghani, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, Al-Qastalani, Abu al-Hasan al-Sindi. These guys are all Persian, Arab, Turkic. I'm sure we could find some Bosnians. Who's Ak-Hisari? Wasn't he Bosnian?
Some of them are.
Yeah.
But it is frequently present. Some of them are Ottomans.
Yeah. Okay, so here's the thing. So I said, I want to know what African people who would actually identify with this description, what do they say? It's very hard to find. I'll tell you why. It's interesting. Scholars in like West, especially West Africa, from the 1000s, 1200s, really the earliest scholarship we know of is like the 1300s, 1400s. That's when we know about scholars, their writings. Some of their writings have survived, or their reputations are known. There's one scholar like Kanemi in the 1000s who moves to Marrakesh, or he moves, I think, to Fez from Kanem, which is around the Lake Chad area. But they study hadiths a lot, and they write lots of works about the Prophet, lots of praise poetry about the Prophet. But I can't find any hadith commentaries that have survived or that are even reported. There's some written by Shanaqata, scholars from Shinqit, but which is in Mauritania. In America, they'd be considered black, but they don't consider themselves black. So that's not a reliable way. They don't consider themselves Sudan. So it's
still Timbuktu scholars.
Also, not
No commentaries.
Not that I know of. There are some books in Timbuktu, but the problem is, Timbuktu, there's two groups, right? There's people who are Bidan and Sudan. Bidan is like Berbers, Arabs, but for Ahmed Baba, it was Berber. Again, if you get a picture of them and you brought it to the United States, you would say, oh, you guys are all black. But the Berbers consider themselves Bidan, whites, and and they were colleagues, like they work with each other and stuff. There's not like some racial problem like in the United States, but there's certain groups that are Sudan, like the Fulan tribe is Sudan, Wangara or Fulan. So I haven't found any evidence, but I did see in the writings of the founder of the Sokoto Caliphate, Osman Danfadio, who died 1817 of the Common Era, from what's now kind of Hausa land. He's a Fulani people, but he lives in like kind of, it's now northwest Nigeria. And he creates this big state, which includes a lot of like Burkina Faso, northwest Nigeria, Niger, Chad, parts like areas of these countries. And also his son and his successor, Muhammad Bello, who's also they're both very good scholars. They're really impressive, like Maliki fuqaha. They're really interesting kind of Ash'ari theologians. They're in the Qadri tariqah. So they're Sufi, they're Maliki, they're Sufis, and they're Ash'ari in their theology. So they both wrote a lot. And this is interesting. They both use this hadith in their writings. But they don't say anything. They don't say like, hey, but don't be offended. There's no anxiety whatsoever. They just use it. It's interesting. They don't see any anxiety. There's a scholar who died just a few years ago, Sheikh Muhammad Amin al-Harari. He wrote a giant commentary on Sahih Muslim and a giant commentary on Sunan ibn Majah. He's Ethiopian. He's actually Habashi. So this hadith literally says, Abdun Habashiyun Ra'su Kazabiba, right? He's actually Habashi. So I went to his writings on this hadith. I was like, oh my God, now I'm going to see, finally, zero, he writes about it, but exactly the same way that earlier scholars wrote about it. He had not one indication of anxiety about this. Except one thing he says. He says, this is not to insult Ethiopians, because Ethiopians at the time of the Prophet were like a very respected civilization. And this is true, right? So first of all, we know the Muslims go to Ethiopia first. Second of all, they knew there's so many words in the Quran that have Ethiopian Injil, mimbar. Mimbar is an Ethiopian word. We know the Prophet, ﷺ, in lots of hadiths, he uses Ethiopian words. We know that there's Ethiopians present not just as slaves, but who come as delegations. During the war between Ibn Zubayr and the Umayyads, there's a group of Ethiopian soldiers who come to fight with Ibn Zubayr in Mecca. They're not slaves. They're sent as a military unit by the Najashi. Okay, so he just says, this is one thing he says that you don't see in other commentaries, but otherwise, Sheikh Imam Amin Harari's commentary is exactly the same as prior Muslim scholars. So I'm not going to tell people how to feel. I'm not going to tell people what they should be offended or not offended by, but we can say that Muslim scholars who were from Africa, who consider themselves Black African, who were Ethiopian, who consider themselves Ethiopian, gave no indication of any unease with this hadith, which I think is very interesting. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Jonathan. Now, if you have any questions before we conclude our session for this evening, and I think that one of the main sentences that is mentioned regarding how companions were respecting even those who are not from that noble origin is when Umar was talking about Abu Bakr. He said, Abu Bakr Sayyiduna. Abu Bakr is the noble among us. وَأَعْتَقَ سَيِّدَنَا. And he freed the noble one, meaning Bilal. So the status in that time was mainly related to what is nobility in the essence, and that is piety, that is your relationship with your Creator. If you have any questions, Professor Ahmed, please.
May I start? Yes. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this. As you may know, at least we don't consider ourselves racist and don't consider having a problem with racism, but we do have another problem with it, which is genocide. And we are very, very sensitive to all discussions around that topic. But then, lately, very popular idea about genocide is that it has like stages, usually 8 stages. The last one is denial. However, the first one is considered to be classification of people. You classify people, and then we come to the Quran, and of course to the Hadith, where you have, us and them, mu'minun, kuffar, gawrs, and so on, and specifically Quranic verses talking about kuffar as an'am, bal hum adall, and so on. So in the light of what you just said about, blackness in the Quran and Sunnah, how would you respond to the accusation that actually Quran and Hadith, Muslim scripture, is preparing kind of, paving the road to genocide of others?
I mean, I'm not, first of all, I'm not a genocide denier. I just want to make that clear. Just to put that out there. I don't support genocide. I condemn genocide.
Recorded.
Yeah, okay. I would like that underlined.
To the topic.
Okay, so so there's 2 things I would say. One is that human beings, it's the second you have values, you're going to create in-groups and out-groups, and you're going to create hierarchy. So humans are, in human society, hierarchy and distinction is inevitable because humans have ideas and have values and have relationships. And the second you have these things, you're going to have people you have a relationship with, people you don't have a relationship, people you're closer with, people you're farther with, people who agree with you and who don't agree with you, people who do something well, people who do something not so well. You're going to have hierarchy, you're going to have groups. So I think sometimes a lot of these ideas, this discourse is kind of aiming to sort of just wipe all these distinctions away. It sort of wants a society in which distinctions aren't made, in which colors don't exist, tribes don't exist, religion doesn't exist, right? Kind of like John Lennon song or something, right? But the problem is that's not how human beings work. We have families, we have relationships. Unless you do like some kind of Pol Pot social engineering and split people away from their families and things like that, you're not going to be able to avoid this. So I think first of all, you're never going to be able to get rid of these lines or the existence of lines. So then the question is, how do you manage those lines? And I think the Quran is a revelation that comes with a lot of values and with a lot of judgments about what's right and what's wrong. And it says that people who call the prophet a liar, who don't believe in revelation from God, who don't believe in the one God who created the heavens and the earth and sustains us, who don't believe in people should be judged by their piety and their good deeds. We know all the things that the Quran criticizes, right? And we know that it criticizes kuffar who are, dumber than animals in the sense that if you have someone who's sitting there, they know the Prophet, ﷺ, the Quran is coming to them in their own language, they're not misunderstanding anything. They see all the miracles that are done, and they still refuse to believe. Why? Because our forefathers didn't do this. Okay, this person is like an animal. They're not reasoning, they're not like a human being. So we have to think about how do you manage that. And the Quran and the Sunnah very clearly give us rules for managing these things. The one, you can have relationship with unbelievers. You have alaykum haqq, right? They have haqq on you. We have this hadith in Mu'jam al-Tabarani and other books that, your Muslim neighbor and relative has 3 rights on you, right? They have the right of relationship, the right of relative, the right of being a neighbor, and the right of being Muslim. A Muslim neighbor who's not relative has the right of being a Muslim and the right of being a neighbor. A neighbor who's not Muslim has the right of a neighbor on you. What does that mean? The Prophet says, you have to, if you're making food, you offer them to them. If they have a good day, you say congratulations. If they have a bad day, you say, I'm sorry. You can't make food if the smell reaches them, you have to go offer them the food, right? You have to lend them money if they need help. You have to help them out. And what is a neighbor? What is jar? According to Alwaleed bin Talal, it's anyone in the 40 houses away from you, or anyone who even hears the adhan in the same area. And these are people who are not Muslims. So, if your neighbor, if you have to help your neighbor when they need you, if you have to give them food if they're hungry, or even if you just make food, you have to offer that to them, I'm pretty sure you can't do genocide against them. So, and I always love this line of this movie. I think it's a great line. In Lawrence of Arabia, this King Faisal, Prince Faisal says, for Lawrence, mercy is compassion is an obsession. For me, it is merely good manners. You may judge which of the two is more reliable. I think one of the problems in, certainly American politics today, I can't talk about other countries, is people are too obsessed with principles. If I think you're wrong on something, you have one political position, I think I have another political position, and I think that you having this position means you're such a bad person. You're so awful. I cannot relate to you. I can't talk to you. I can't be seen with you. I can't sit next to you. I can't eat with you. That to me is the path to othering and to genocide, eventually. But if I say, I can't stand Ahmed. His ideas are so stupid. Oh my God, I can't stand this guy. But he comes up and says salam. I have to say salam alaikum. I have to shake his hand. Faddal, please come and have some food with me. Come to my house, I sit down, we'll have a meal. I can't stand this guy. God, I hate this guy's ideas. But I'm definitely not going to kill you. I think that adab, there's a reason for adab. And we have this notion, it's almost like this weird Rousseauian notion that we all have to walk around like our authentic selves, like wearing our authentic beliefs and emotions on our sleeve. That's a disaster. That's a disaster. You don't want to know what's going on. I do not want to know what's going on in your head. You don't want to know what's going on in my head. You don't want to know all the insane things I think about. Because every human being is just completely bonkers to other people. And so that's why we have adab. And you have this notion of haqq, that you have to give this person, even if you don't like them. So I think that's really an important point, is that it's not about liking someone or disliking someone, thinking they're wrong or thinking, and thinking you're right. That's not the issue. The issue is the constraints that are put on us by urf, by adab, and it's really when those things get worn down and fragmented that you have conflict.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Vanessa.
Thank you again for engaging let's say, people, like non-Muslims, seeing Muslims and being like, oh, they're anti-Black and stuff like that. But in Europe, we can see a lot of examples where Muslims are like, oh no, he's Black and I'm better than him. And I've met quite a few people also in Bosnia where we have like this mentality where they're like, yeah, but you know, he's an Arab or he's like, oh, he comes from Egypt. You know, there has to be like a division between me and him. How can we, as Muslim community, fight those prejudices among ourselves?
Yeah, so I mean, in one way, you know, so it's to a certain extent like these things are understandable, right? So if let's say, you know, why am I going to use myself? Let's say there's an American guy, okay, and he's really loud, and he's always doing this, and he's always listening to American music, and et cetera, et cetera. And there's a Bosnian family, and they're very Bosnian, and they're quiet, and they're polite, and they do Bosnian stuff, and they like Bosnian music and Bosnian language. And this daughter wants to marry this American guy, and they're both Muslim, right? This great Muslim guy, just like me, wonderful Muslim guy. You know, it's understandable. Like, how's this guy going to talk to people? He's not really going to fit in. You know, by the way, we have different lifestyles, and eventually it's going to be a conflict. So, to a certain extent, like, you know, there's different urfs, there's different adat, and if you don't have, it's very interesting. Muslim scholars, I'd say, if you really want to criticize Muslim scholars, it's not for racism; it's for classism. They're very class-oriented. But that's not, I don't think that's because they're elitists. It's because they're very realistic. They understand, if you take a rich girl, a rich woman, and you get a poor guy, he might be the best Muslim. And maybe she's very, like, she's very pious, her family's very pious, and it will work out. But most people, that's going to be a disaster. For very simple reasons. I'm always, every year we used to go to Switzerland to ski. I want to go to Switzerland to ski. I can't afford that. Oh, I'm not important to you, et cetera. Now it's a big problem. So, that's one. We don't want to think that all like notions of us and them are wrong, or like some of them, they're just part of our lives. But on things like, a lot of it is just flat out racism, and that stuff has to be counteracted. It's very interesting when you look at, like, especially in Maliki law. The irony of a Maliki school is the most egalitarian. At the founding, Malik ibn Anas just says the only thing kafa is deen. Muslim, that's it. But when you get to like later medieval Maliki law, they can be very, very class and race, because race and class actually overlap a lot in, let's say, North Africa. So very racist, in effect, okay? But then you say to them, hey, what about these hadiths? You know, if the Prophet says there's, you know, one people, the black person doesn't have any, or non-Arab and Arab has no virtue over the other except by piety. And what about the hadith of if a man comes to you whose religion you like, marry your daughter to them, or marry them, or else there'll be great fitna in the land. They say this was for the time of the Prophet to break the back of the Jahiliyyah pride. And they broke the back, and alhamdulillah, now everybody has to go by their own urf. Even if we take that argument, which I think is a bad argument, let's accept it. Today, this is a real disease. This is a real sickness in our societies. Like, racism is American society is just sick to the bone with this stuff. I don't want to talk about other places, but so in some ways, I think we have to be, nowadays, we have to be like the Prophet was, and we have to purposefully miscegenate. This word miscegenate means to interracial marriage. We have to purposely miscegenate to break these stereotypes.
Let us take one or two. Hamza, then you, Hassan. 2 questions and we will finish for this evening. Hamza.
Hamza,
thank you for a very beautiful and informative speech. I will ask you just 2 really short questions. First, you know about narration when Abu Zar al-Ghifari told the Bilal, son of black mother. Can we say that there is some type of racism in that time amongst the companions of Prophet, peace be upon him? And the second question is, what's about pictures?
Oh yeah, I was going to talk about that. So the first thing is, it's actually interesting. There's 2 hadiths. One is which Abu Dhar says son of a black man, but that's, it's not Bilal. So, wait, hang on. There's one where he insults a slave and the Prophet gives him a lecture about treatment of slaves. There's another one where Bilal gets insulted, but it's a different hadith. So people get these, they conflate these two, except there's one narration, I think, in the Sharh al-Bukhari of Allahumma salli Muhammad, the guy from Al-Andalus, Ibn Battal. It's one narration where it identifies it as, it's not in the Bukhari, it's a narration in the Sharh, where it identifies it as Bilal, but we don't know if this is reliable or not. But people oftentimes get these stories mixed up. The story where Abu Dhar insults a slave because of his mother, the Prophet says, Ya Abu Dhar, inta imra'un fihi jahiliya, or fika jahiliya, right? You are a person who has jahiliya in them. And this is a really interesting point that this one scholar in England named Taj al-Islam, he's doing his PhD at Leeds. He's an alim, but he's doing his PhD. He has an excellent video on this. You can look it up on YouTube. It's called, if you look up Bilalian studies, like Bilal-ian, like Bilalian studies, Taj al-Islam, T-A-G-U-L, last name Islam, I-S-L-A-M. He has a great video. And he says that there's no medieval Arabic word for racism. By the way, when did the word racism get invented? Anybody know? In the 1930s. In the 1930s. It's very, in a European, any language. The notion of race, the way we think of it in the modern world, is really kind of developed in like the 1700s. But he says there is a word for racism in Arabic, in classical Arabic. It's jahiliya. That's the word. Jahiliya is when you think that you are better than this. It's insolent arrogance, arrogant insolence. Why does he say inta imran fi jahiliya? Why does he use that word? He could say like, don't be mean, don't insult your brother. He uses this word jahiliya, which is really interesting. And in another hadith, when they insult Bilal, the Quraysh insult Bilal after he gives the adhan, after they conquer Mecca, they say they only have this ghurab, this crow, to give the adhan. The Prophet gives the verse of Surah Al-Hujurat comes down, and akramakum indallahi atqakum, this comes down, is revealed, and the Prophet gives a speech. He says that God has driven from you the pride and arrogance of jahiliyyah. So this notion of jahiliyyah is very closely linked in the Prophet's language and in his teachings to what we would think of as racism. This is a very interesting picture. This is from a place called Qaryat al-Faw, which is a village, a town, which is about, it's southeast of Mecca, and if you know where Najran is on the border between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, if you go kind of, here's Mecca, here's Najran, it's sort of here, right? There's a town that was excavated probably from around the 1st century of the Common Era, so about 500, 600 years before Islam. There's examples of writing in old epigraphic South Arabian script, but there's writing in an old version of Arabic. So it's actually some of the earliest traces we have of Arabic, like a kind of early Arabic language. And they had these paintings, which is really interesting. So this is maybe the best example we have of Arabs drawing themselves kind of before Islam, in a couple hundred years before Islam. It's very interesting, I thought. One, like, you can see like the lighting. They have the light on the forehead. I mean, the nose, they're doing like shading of their faces. They have very fine mustaches. He has beard stubble. And, but his skin is like, you might call it like a burnt ochre color or sienna, burnt sienna.
Red? Red.
Yeah, it's almost a reddish. This is, of course, they're limited by what they can paint, but there's a lot of colors here. There's brown, there's green, there's black, there's white, there's, so, you know, they only have so many colors, but it's interesting that they chose these colors. And this is very similar to the way you'd see like a Roman era mosaic or painting of the same time. Very similar skin tone, which is kind of interesting. I just thought it's really interesting to see how they're portraying themselves.
Thank you. Last question. We have Hassan for the last question, and we will conclude with that.
Thank you, Professor Brown, for the lecture. I would like to hear your experience about this. We are in the situation where we communicate the truth of the deen with word. But there is some modern concepts of science and studies. They do not recognize Dirasat or Islamia or theology like studies in science. There is many reasons. One of the reasons is the believer's feeling. Okay, sometimes when we learn about the messenger, alayhi salam, it's kind of we are searching for the excuses for him. What is the heart? What is the between that kind of feeling and real methodology and the loop?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. I kind of wrote a book on this. It's called Misquoting Muhammad. It's been translated into Bosnian, I think. I mean, you can see this in the hadith tradition, right? So sometimes you'll find a hadith like, let's say, la yadkhul al-jannah ibn zina, walad zina, right? So the child born of zina does not enter heaven. This hadith is, it's not in any of the main books of hadith. It's not, and it gets criticized regularly, criticized for its isnad, criticized for its meaning, which is a huge violation of the Quranic principle, la tazir waziratun wizra ukhra. But then some scholars, Muslim scholars, still defend it because they say, maybe the Prophet said this, maybe we can find out, maybe there's some way to understand it. So maybe it's, walad zina is like someone who does zina a lot, like Ibn Kurat al-Qadam or something. You're the guy who plays Kurat al-Qadam a lot. You're Ibn Zina, you do zina a lot. Or like maybe Ibn Zina is, walad zina is like, because the egg is fertilized in a sinful action, like somehow the person is going to be, these arguments I think are bad arguments. But the point is, some Muslim scholars made those arguments. They're doing what you're saying. They're trying to find ways to explain it. But in this case, why do that? Because the hadith is not reliable. Why spend all this energy on something that's not reliable from an isnad perspective? So I think there is no way to draw a line that everybody's going to respect. For me, I tend to think about something that's very useful is not the question of like the scripture you're looking at, but what are our sensibilities? I mean, if we're criticizing a Quranic verse or a hadith for a reason that is very new in human experience, I'm very skeptical of this. I don't know why people today in the last year decided something is important. Like, I mean, this happens all the time in America. Like, oh, this movie would not be allowed to be shown today. Seinfeld, Friends would never be accepted today. We can't even watch TV from 10 years ago now. I mean, let alone like something from it. I mean, we cut ourselves off constantly from our own heritage. And, there's a lot of stuff made in the past is just garbage and it's racist and it's awful, and I'm not defending that. But I mean, when does a sensibility needs to earn its right, it needs to earn the right to be taken seriously. We can't just take everybody's sensibilities, the latest ideas as gospel and throw out every other thing that we valued because of this. So I tend to think like, that's why I really like looking at pre-modern sensibilities. Like, how did people in the pre-modern period look at this? If they didn't really care about this stuff, about some issue, I tend not to take it very seriously because, modern humans have proven really good at a couple of things. One is destroying the planet, right? I mean, through nuclear bombs, through whatever, and through the environment. So I'm not so sure that we our sensibilities and our view of the world should be authoritative for our species.
Jonathan, can we take the last question? Short, please. Make it short.
Thank you for this interesting topic. My name is Mirza, and while you were speaking about fairness, about dark and black, I remember one example from my life. Once I went to beach side and I was diving during the day and everything was like exciting, wonderful, and after that, during the night, I was diving at the same place and I felt like completely different emotion. I was scared because I didn't see anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was dark. So my conclusion is if something is unknown, hidden, you can feel like anxiety. Nowadays, we almost know everything about each other. We have like thousands of informations. We live in multicultural societies. We have hundreds of interpretations, and we still face up to prejudices, even between Muslims. And also, I'll try to finish. I heard many examples from people that went to pilgrimage, and they were speaking like, oh, you know that those Malaysians, they are so stronger than us, so they can come closer to Kaaba, and also some other black people. So that happens between Muslims. How we can fix up with this problem now?
Well, Malaysians and Indonesians are usually smaller, but they have very organized little groups, and they have like the triangle. They're like, so that, I mean, look, it's really, you know, in some ways it's silly. Like you can't, our discourse is such that we can't even talk about cultural difference. Like if you were to, what I just said about Malaysians and Indonesians, someone's going to be like, oh, that's racist. It's like, look, I'm sorry. If you go to Hajj, you see actually different cultures manifested. And yeah, people are not fi alwanikum wa alsinatikum aya. You know, this is a sign for us from God. Humans aren't all the same, different cultures, and you can see things in other cultures that you want to imitate. You can see things you don't like, but I mean, like, you know, you have to. Everybody has good sides and bad sides. You know, every culture has good sides and bad sides, and oftentimes they're the opposite side of one another. So I can't tell me, people tell me, I want to go to America, I want to have all this money that you have, I want to have like but I was like, okay, but you sit around with your cousin all day and have fun. You can't do that in America. Like, you're always visiting your aunt and your cousin, and you're going visiting. No more of that. You're going to be in some city 2,000 miles away from your relatives. You're going to be working 10 hours a day, and you're going to be miserable. And you're going to have money, but you're going to, anyway, I wish I were back in Bosnia where I can hang out with my friends and relax and drink coffee and stuff. So you can't have one without the other. I think a lot of times, this is one of the wisdoms I've learned, is that the good things about people are often also the bad things about people.
Thank you, professors. We would like to thank him for his lecture.